ask or, yeah, here we go, we're recording. Yeah, this is our normal procedure, is to record all classes. What we're planning on doing, but we can discuss it if anyone has concerns, is save this. Is it just on Canvas or is it on YouTube through Canvas, Wenmeo?
It's just on Canvas.
Okay, so that's fine. That is, the main reason to record is that if you miss, one of you is sick or miss a class or you're traveling, you can listen to the discussion, or you can listen a second time if you said, did she really say that? So you can look at that and think about it, and I do that for sure. I listened to my lectures the next day. I said, my God, how could I have said that? So I improve over time. I hope. Does anyone have a concern about the recording like that? Okay, good. Two of you did not shake your heads. GHN, is this okay? And I see one more, got names here. Lower right, who's in the lower? Okay. Yeah, does anyone want to comment if you have reservations or concerns about the recording? No. Okay, let's just push on. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, it says 9, but including me, so there are 8 of you here. We have 1 or 2 persons who may still join us today or in the future. Okay. Administrative. As I mentioned in the syllabus, I taught this course for 10 years or so with John Levy-Martin, and this is the first time I'm doing it alone, and I really, as you can see, if you compare it, it's a pretty drastic revision. I tried to lay out more explicitly in the syllabus itself than we did before some of the big themes, so you're not totally surprised when you come to class. I mean, what's the background? Why does Clifford Geertz fit in here at all, and so forth. So I tried to lay those things out, and Clifford Geertz I wrote more on than anybody else because I had a hard time fitting him in, because he wrote contradictory themes and people wrote so many contradictory themes about him. But anyway, the course also has deliberately many different varied themes in the cultural domain, and that's the nature of the field. It's the nature of many fields in social science, and we can celebrate it. But it also means if we want to both help ourselves, communicate with others, understand phenomena which are going on, we often need multiple views. One way to put this is, and here's linking this to your statements. One suggestion that I've made in statements like this, right near the beginning, is whenever you have a topic you're interested in, such as feminism in China or a turning point in science, try to articulate at least 3 plausible propositions. That is, what are different reasons that might explain what I'm trying to understand? And there often are more than 3, but if you say, but the main point is, don't just have one hypothesis, or worse, none at all. Say, well, the data will tell me. Haha. So in that sense, if you push yourself to say, I mean, why was this happening? Or how is Chinese nationalism emerging as it is? Or what is it? Which is where Wenmeo is in her statement. push yourself to think in terms of multiple options right from the beginning. And that is why we have the syllabus laying out multiple conflicting views of what's going on. Sometimes these are implicit. People may do what some are calling cultural erasure. Don't mention your enemies or the other people, just don't cite them. Versus attacking, which we have on lots of now American television. It's become a classic style of attacking to make more impact in ways that talk shows do this, whereas that was not the case 10 to 20 years ago, where it was much more gentlemanly, ladylike. Or I was one of 5 people in Norway where we reviewed the top research institutions and the top grants of all the Norwegians, and I guess it was in political science, or maybe it's the urban area. And an Italian guy and it was I think a 2 or 3 day long. It was a long meeting, 2-3 day meeting, and all these speakers came in and they said, "Here's my research. Here's why I'm doing this." That is, they didn't just give us the papers. We listened to them talk. We cross-examined them, which is sort of what some of you are doing. You've got a phenomenon and you've got a potential interpretation, but generally you don't have multiple competing interpretations or people saying why I'm doing this. Someone is imposing an interpretation. You're not listening or looking. For instance, another way to do this, if you got historical data, is read biographies or read interviews where people say, "Yes, I invented this new type of lag in science, and I published a paper here, and I did this and this and this." And someone else may say that, I mean, you have in your statement, yes, Yiling Lin. In your statement, you mentioned very big differences, but you don't really have an interpretation or suggest why were they so different. So if we try to think of, so you've got lots on the measures, and that's great. So what I'm doing now, I'm giving you a few general overview comments that apply to all of you ideally, and that are part of doing science and social science. And I've taught courses also on sociology of science, history of science with Edward Shills, with Joseph Ben-David. I was a student of Robert Merton and Lazarsfeld. I was a student with John Cole and Steve Cole, who really, and Harriet Zuckerman, who really started a lot of this field at Columbia decades back. And then my PhD was on the French University and the emergence of the social sciences in the 19th century. So I did archival work. I interviewed activists. I interviewed people who were I deliberately chose people who are retired and who wouldn't have their careers potentially disrupted if they said the wrong thing to me. And they didn't care if I published it. And I had a dramatically different interpretation of how it worked. Instead of saying it was universalistic or right and the best ideas always won, and I said, that's part of the legal structure. The legal structure is one model, sort of the official statement of science in advance is a second. My third view was, it's a clientelist system. People reward their friends. They build their own ideas. They hire people who are their disciples. They create journals. And so, but I never said it was totally that way. I said it's a mixture of each of these things. You still have to work within the legal structure. You still have to deal to some degree with being original in ways that people in Norway or Canada will read you and take you seriously, or you won't be advanced. But at the same time, there's a lot of clientelism. So these 3 different interpretations are interrelated. And so I'm suggesting you don't need to say that one is right and 2 are wrong. 3 things all may be working simultaneously, and there may be conflict among them. So if you think of that in advance and look for it, and look for what people themselves are saying about why, and ask questions if you can interview, why did I do this? Why am I doing this? that's a first simple, obvious source of hypotheses. What do the activists say? Second, and related, after you've got your hypotheses, after you've got 5 pages or 50 pages, you can have a draft of a whole book. You can take it around. I mean, I finished my PhD and then I spent 5 more years revising it. So I then keep going to meetings with people and I say, I have an interpretation. What do you think of this? So I'd give them, I'd tell them my what I thought were my best ideas. And some would say, oh, you're dead wrong. No, that's not true. Or you're leaving this out. So then I'd try to, how can I incorporate the comment of that person? So use your data source as a serious dialogue potential for what you're writing and thinking about. At every stage, before you start, early, in the middle, beginning, near the end, and then when you revise it for, that is 5 years later, you may say, well, that was a bad MA. Okay, I was wrong. And I've read many MAs that have been totally refuted, including PhDs and academic books. People make mistakes, or they more often, it's not simply right or wrong. More often it is they choose a special case and then generalize to the world without any clue as to how far they can legitimately generalize, or why can you generalize. How many people think of Chinese nationalism the way they do on one website? And how can we capture the degree to which the one website is illustrative or not? So what Wen Miao has done, and is briefly mentioned and I've seen longer versions of this, is she uses one of the most popular television programs, it's online or television or both, I guess, in China, of a rural young woman. She started this at, I don't know what it was, age 17 or something like that. She does things like cook rural traditional Chinese food. And one of Wen Miao's major examples, in a separate data source, a website of nationalist Chinese, take an example from the big popular program of, is kimchi Chinese or Korean? And so the woman, the popular author, popular artist, if you will, said, this is Chinese. Said, here's how we cook a traditional Chinese dish. But there was a huge outcry and then interpretation of this. And so what the 2 data sources that Wen Miao used there shows the generality of the phenomenon, the conflicting and differential way of potentially interpreting it, leading to a very important topic in the minds of the Chinese nationalist activists. So that using the 2 sources, both of them basically qualitative, this is almost an entirely qualitative study so far, she has shown by combining the 2, the importance of this for many people in China. Then she zooms in with a microscope and goes to the website of strong nationalist activists writing just about this, nationalism. But thinking about this so what I'm doing is sort of articulating a little more than she did maybe in her statement, thinking how can I use a methodology, like I mentioned, for example, interviewing as I did retired persons, because I knew if you're at the beginning of a career, you say, what do you have to do to get ahead in molecular biology? And maybe that people are probably not going to say, what I've been told, I've been told about more than one country in the world, you got to pay somebody money to get a job. Corruption, direct cash corruption. In Taiwan, there are books that say, not just books, they say, this year to pay for a presidential vote, the normal price is $543 for each person to vote for you. It's okay if something is that market fixed. That's pretty precise corruption. Even in Chicago, which is the capital city of corruption in the U.S., it hasn't been quantified and precisely measured. Okay, so especially because these things may be illegal, irresponsible, challenging other people around you, you've got to be careful about where and how to interview and what to say. And obviously what you write up, they're human subjects issues. Obviously you don't want if you do anything where you damage anybody else's potential, you have huge, I'll just ask as a question. How many of you have had some kind of human subjects issue or concern which has been articulated, say, by your mentor, one of your advisors, who has said, you need to go through this university's human subjects procedures, and here's how you do it? Have anybody can say yes or nobody? Yeah, so one to Taylor Barrett only. Taylor, you want to mention just that little bit of what that involved for you?
Sure, yeah. So my study involves talking to people about their relationship to their work and their financial life. And so that's sensitive because I don't want to jeopardize their career potential at all, or publish anything that could damage them in their working lives. So I have to be really careful about maintaining anonymity. So I had to go through some training before the IRB process.
But who told you that? And who helped you do it, if anyone?
Oh, my preceptor, but I don't know. I don't remember any direct conversation, but just in classes.
Yeah, no, but that's the normal. I would say talk to your preceptor in the MAP. Many of you are in the MAPS program. Talk to your preceptor about this if you have anything where you're doing interviews and where people are talking to you in a way that Taylor has described. Okay. And that I used to be chairman of the Human Subject Committee for Social Science Division. I think for 8 years I did this, and at the beginning it was very sensitive and people fought over it and so forth. It's now classic, but it has also become much more powerful, much more supervisory, much more legally required than it was in the past. Okay. Any other sort of general points like that before we go to your individual statements? Okay. What order should we know? How about a random order, which is the order in which I just happen to paste them in my file? Then I can read and I can type in right on your statement if that's acceptable. We presume everybody has read everybody's statement line by line, including Yi-Ling Lin, who sent us the most extensive one. So congratulations to all. All right. Paratosh Kanoria is not here. Okay, so that I think that the says the conclusion for the writing. So okay, when would you want to send Paratosh Kanoria? Do you? I think you have. Do you have a copy of an email? If he or she knows that we're meeting right now and she's welcome to join us. Okay, great.
I mean, he later emailed me that he decided to enroll in this course for next year because he won't take this course this quarter.
Okay, fine. No, I did not see that. Okay, fair enough. So then I'm wrong. Okay, good. That's easily done. All right. Theo, I'll ask you to pronounce your last name.
Ichlirek.
Say it again.
Ichlirek.
Ichlirek. Okay. Well, you've got a pretty visibly conflictual highly publicized, big topic in the news. Lots of people writing about this, maybe people making all kinds of conflicting claims. So, and you've got an effort to discuss hypotheses. So good for you. Why don't you lead off and tell us about it a little bit?
Okay, so really a lot of the important stuff I put in the piece I sent, but my puzzle essentially has to do with anti-democratic social movements framing their claims in democratic terms. I begin with the Capitol insurrection, in which, you know, by all accounts here is an event which, you know, a number of social movement organizations that come together to try to overturn an election, which, you know, by all legal and, you know, official accounts was completely legitimate, but they claim their, you know, their attempts to overturn it in democratic language. The attempt is to stop the steal of what is a fraudulent election. And recent polling supports this too, in that some, depending on the poll, somewhere around 7 in 10 Republicans do doubt the legitimacy of the election. And the theoretical puzzle is that a lot of the literature, mainstream literature on the sociology of democracy, would count this as an anti-democratic intervention. So some historical context. I guess I'll start with the hypothesis first. I hypothesize that this could be resolved by thinking of democracy in terms of the people rather than a process, a set of institutions, or a series of procedures. And I suggest that perhaps we need to focus on the relationship between citizens and the creation of the other, or in, you know, in more clear terms, the notion that some people may be for democratic institutions, processes, but may disagree on who can join that table. So the idea is that perhaps we must decenter the state, which is at the end of the day an involuntary association. So for some historical context, you know, this isn't new, these exclusionary democratic claims. The 1920s KKK, you know, sought to exclude non-whites, Catholics, Jews, immigrants, Bolsheviks, you name it, while still using this language of democracy. And so the contemporary case I'd like to focus on, just to make analysis easier, is the Proud Boys. And I'd like to make the case that they're a good case on 2 counts. First, their visibility at the Capitol riots, and, you know, in news that's been emerging over the last month or two, you see more and more, you know, regional leaders, national leaders that are being caught up in all this. And, you know, one big report by the New York Times suggested that they conspired with the Oath Keepers to actually plan an intervention once they were in. So it wasn't a matter of just showing up and, you know, protesting. And 2, they're curious because in their early stages, especially, they tried to distance themselves from the alt-right. Their claim was one of oppression. They presented as in favor of multiculturalism, but only to the extent that white men created the Western world. So there's this veneer of multiculturalism, of almost political correctness, which is ironic because, you know, that's one of the main things they seem to be upset about since their founding. So in terms of this class, I suppose I'd like to work more on these notions of group identity formation, the constitution of a people, what it means to be a patriot, because a lot of this, it seems to me, is, you know, led by this discourse of what it means to being American and of creating the other, whether that may be, you know, communists during the Cold War, or Antifa and Democrats and socialists today. Yeah, that's the bulk of it. Sorry if I went too long.
Okay, now fascinating topic, great overview. That is, like, I would say half of the rest of you, you've got something which is quite, let's say it's a current event. It's something which is hot today, like feminism or Chinese nationalism, but on which there's very little immediate, specific, serious research. And so what do you do about that? And what most of you have very little about what we could call a review of the literature or past work more generally. Most of you don't even, at least explicitly, list that as a visible concern. I would say, and probably for all of you, and right here as well, why not think about two obvious things to build in potentially to maybe all of you, but right here it fits. Look for bigger sources of hypotheses. I mean, bigger, say broader, different, additional. Their source. Push yourself to find alternative interpretations, and the press is filled with them right now. There are even books that are coming out. Much of this is obviously journalistic, descriptive, but I'm sure I bet you could find 15 interpretations or 15 factors which led to people storming the Congress, or the specific, or why the Proud Boys exist and how their dynamics work. So I'd say maybe all of you, push for 3 serious ones, but I bet you can all find 15 interpretations of what you're writing about if you look. So source 1 for the Proud Boys is just current media. Source 2 is the course readings. That is, as you read each work through the course, think, and that's part of why this is fun to be doing this. Most of you are doing MA theses. Some are not, but most are. And this gives you an immediate practical rationale. How can I do a better MA? And how can I make it into a journal article, maybe a PhD thesis, but something which is an original interpretation that I can do. And if you do it right, play your cards right, you can make an MA into a journal article, into a serious, important original contribution. And I would add, often that's more likely to happen if you do it with others. In some cases, a co-author of a junior, senior author, working with someone very close on a bigger project. Others can just do it in a seminar like this. If we talk to each other, give each other help, critique, read, come back, then go to each other, we can either point out ideas, and or people might be able to collaborate. For instance, on we got feminism as two or three examples. Wen Miao also doesn't have it visible, but she made a presentation on feminism in China in a class where she was TA this winter. So she's thought about these issues too. Okay, so that's maybe 3 people working on feminism, for instance, or aspects thereof. And so if you can talk to people and then say, well, what are some sharper, more specific hypotheses? And then how can we potentially build on the best work which we've been able to find? And we've tried to put in most cases, the best work anybody's ever done in any place in the world, in the course readings about culture. So if you can, as Merton said, stand on their shoulders, you will see further than if you just try to start yourself from scratch. So these are ways of trying to stand on the shoulders of others, and that's one of the simple definitions of science, knowledge more generally. Okay, anybody else have a quick comment on the Proud Boys for Teo right now? Okay, so those are they're interpretations, election fraud, role of elites. I mean, yeah, these are all, I mean, you thought about this seriously, and it shows, and it's great. It's an excellent topic. And it's perfect for us to talk about. Okay, so Yiling Lin. I studied management science. Okay, novelty in the scientific. Okay, so now that's your brief statement. Then you sent about a 10-page version to us all, and sure. Why don't we? Well, sure. Let's go ahead with you. So I've got that just pasted there briefly at the end, and then I've got the full thing in my preview program. The lagging effective turning points in the history of science. Okay, why don't you give us a 3-minute commentary? Either, well, how many of you had a chance to read most of her 10 pages? Okay, so most have not. So why don't you give a flavor and at least an overview of what's there, and let's talk about it.
Sure. My research interest is about the novelty and how novelty is getting accepted by a community, especially the community, the scientific community. So my research question is, why novelty, it takes time for novelty to get accepted in scientific community. And so why I care about this question is because novelty is being novel or being creative is encouraged in many communities, especially in scientific one. But there is a phenomenon that novelty is sometimes not recognized right in the time when a really novel paper was published. So a question would be, what happens for them not accepted right in the time? And one hypothesis is that the creation is is everywhere, but the creation needs wait for its time to be recognized. So it's not a very novel idea could be advanced of its time. And another hypothesis is that a novel papers is change the landscape of the narratives of the scientific community disruptly, and then it takes a long time for its own audience to come, and then it becomes a new field. What I would like to discuss and also explore in more details in this class is how can we define the timing for work, a timing for a novelty, and that's it.
Okay, well, that's a brief, succinct statement. What's in your written 10 pages has lots of methodology, such as how to measure this, and that's good. But I would say what you presented orally is excellent. I mean, that connect directly with, I think, most of the other people in the class. We all can have some kind of view about this, and that's great. I would say, I guess, correlatively, there's not much specific articulation of hypotheses of why. That is, you've got good points on measuring lag, but why there's a short lag or a long lag, which seems to be one of your central questions, is not very articulated in the sense that we did talking about the Proud Boys. That is, what could you do? I mean, first of all, I mean, there's a lot of pretty much literature in the history and sociology of science about this kind of thing. I'm looking back, I mean, you cite Andy Abbott, but beyond Abbott and say Sayutsy, even some of these people, well, okay, so these people, you introduce them more talking about the method, but beyond your, I mean, the key ideas you have are weak ties. You see, your question is, what's the relationship between the weak ties in space and weak ties in time? But you don't posit a hypothesis that this is higher because of that. So what you're doing, you're bringing in variables such as weak ties, that if you have more weak ties, these offer a potential for breaking out from them and doing something more original. But it may be that if you're so weakly tied that nobody, then you publish this brilliant paper, it may take 10 years or may never be picked up. And so someone else may supersede you 10 or 20 years later and publish the same thing and ignore you, and they may never have heard of your work. And that happens all the time too. So I guess I would ask, how much might you, or have you looked, yeah. Actually, why don't we ask each of you when you introduce your own work to say just a word or two about your own background related courses, because some of you may have had 5 courses and you've read 50 books. For others, this may be something that's totally new and you've read nothing, and most of you cite very little, with a couple of big exceptions. But say, Teo, what's your own background coming to this?
In this program?
Yeah, maybe where did you grow up? Where did you go to college? Most of you are that is, if you had something after college and before you're here, and then what were some big any big sources of ideas that really helped you get a focus? That sort of background of that is, that can then lead us to say, well, if you've not had a course that's related at all, how might you, and I'm asking in part because this is related to the idea of the lack of a literature review by most of you. So Teo, what's your background?
All right, so I guess to the extent that it's relevant, I'm originally from Turkey. I moved to the States for high school. As an undergrad, I studied international studies and then switched to sociology here.
Yeah, where did you go to college? Big question for anybody in American university.
Johns Hopkins.
Okay, major university. It's an excellent place and very much for that kind of concern. Okay, terrific.
And then I wrote my thesis with a political scientist in comparative politics, and then switched to sociology when I got into this program. So here I've taken contemporary social theory with Dr. Norsetina, but really my thesis comes from 2 courses I took last quarter, which were sociology of the state with Dr. Clemens and sociology of democracy with Dr. Marco Garrido. Sorry? Okay,
now that's great. That's a good, strong, diverse background, and coming, as several of you have non-US backgrounds, and I would say that's a great strength. You see more things, and you're likely to feel culture shock all the time, because things are being done differently in the US than they are in where you may have grown up. And then if you go beyond the initial culture shock, you can begin to try to codify where and how do these things work. For instance, when I go to Europe now, I can go to any place in Europe and I don't feel culture shock at all. I have a sort of cultural map which holds it together. When I go to Asia or talk to many Asians, I feel continual culture shock. There are just lots of things that I don't yet intuitively pick up. I'm picking up more, but I'm simply saying, don't just see that as a problem or whatever. Probe where there are things, and at least in this example of Teo, great topic. How are the Proud Boys like things going on in the Middle East today? Because if you look at the Proud Boys and the disruption in the U.S. Congress from a Middle Eastern eye, ain't nothing. What are these crazy Americans making such a big deal about a couple of people jumping on okay, so if you then combine that with even what mass media television coverage is of these ISIS, I mean, ISIS got lots of media coverage in the US. And then you have other things that are domestic. You know, they're nothing compared to the violence and the degree of which they're huge cultural challenges. So build on and use your own cultural perspectives, and then try to, I mean, as you've got a strong background, I would say, given that the strength of that, I'm surprised you don't have more citations to something that might have an alternative specific interpretation. So, but I'm saying that to all of you. Okay, then Yiling, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. So I come from China, and I got my undergraduate degree in Beijing Normal University in management science. So basically, my training is all mainly about how to do the modeling stuff and how to like the in the operation research. And then I come to an internship in a startup, which focus on doing some algorithms like the natural language processing. So I guess my background is more technical. And then I come to the Chicago, the computational social science, and it's my second year there. The social theories course I take there is mainly about labor studies, and also about how to ask social science questions, and also about the social process, things like this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So, I mean, so two very different backgrounds. All right. Any other? I sort of asked a question. Maybe Yiling, maybe follow up on the question. Why, or have you thought of or read some other hypotheses about why there's I guess, is it fair to say that one of your central questions is why is there a very short or very long time lag before a paper, a scientific innovation, a new idea is recognized?
I haven't read more reference about it.
Second, all your methodology in your 10-page statement is pretty abstract and quantitative. That is, you've got good discussion of this measure, this measure, this measure, but you don't have qualitative sort of interviews. Those in this example, and I'm going to this because I don't know. I mean, I'm not really up to date on all of the history and sociology of science the way I was in the past. And I taught courses on these topics, but the big ideas of citation indexing and so forth, these are things that I was a graduate student when people were developing these with Merton and Harriet Zuckerman and Jonathan and Steve Cole. But Jonathan Cole has a relatively recent overview book on sort of sociology of science. You might look at that do you know that his name or that book? Jonathan, C-O-L-E, Jonathan Cole. He presented it here 2 or 3 years ago when it came out. I mean, I mentioned that as an overview. Second, in terms of, so I'd say first, look for papers that may deal with the lag of citation time. And if you can find something on that, fine. But second, if you don't, then look for some more qualitative interpretations where people might write about this. When I did my PhD, I was trying to understand, how the whole university system worked. And I had some ideas, but at the beginning, I did not have my big original idea. I didn't have it all at the beginning. So one thing I did was talk to people. I worked in archives. I read everything I could find that was published. Then I also read biographies. I read over 100 biographies of people in all fields, in mathematics, physics, and so forth, even though I was studying the social sciences. And I tried to look for, how did they work with the university? What jobs did they have? What did they study? How did they move in their careers, and why? And often you just have 2 lines or 1 line about something, but it would be quite revelatory. So I would say, given what you're saying, so Harriet Zuckerman related, so look at biography. Second, related, Harriet Zuckerman did a PhD on interviews with Nobel Prize winners. And so she talked about very much the kinds of things that are in your MA. So I would, and so that they often talk about, and well, but so of course also did Merton in his multiple things, but especially on multiple discoveries. So and you cite one of those, I think, a Merton paper on that. But so I'd say look at those obvious things, at least for a bit. And what I'm implicitly also saying for all of you is not only look for competing hypotheses, think about competing data sources and methodologies that you don't, but look for ways of implementing them, not by doing everything yourself. If you can find someone who's already done there are hundreds of papers on feminism. Most of you cite nothing. You can find survey research studies. You can find demographic data. You can find census data. You can find all kinds of different, that is, you don't need to do the data analysis or do the interviews yourself, but look for someone who's already done interviews right on your topic and think about them. And then you could, and an acceptable master's thesis, I'll even add, is just basically doing a review and critique and assessment of past work, theoretical or empirical of various sorts. But thinking thoughtfully and critiquing, and so Merton writes about this as middle range theory, or that is codification. That is, instead of just looking at books in their own terms, if you reframe, rewrite those core ideas in ways that they can take on new meaning, that is your quote. That is, if we just call it a review of the literature, it's a waste of everybody's time. It ought to be a core element which builds and leads into your own hypotheses. And if you can't find anything, look for anecdotes and biographies, even if there's nothing in, like the example of the two sources that I gave for Wenmao. That is the national popular television and the reaction to that. The fact that this big star of Chinese television is talking about this is a very important bit of data to complement your in-depth reading of the discussions of this on a second, much smaller, focused website. So that, in a sense, it's an example of qualitative multiple methods being creatively used to complement one another and to show the generality in the national importance of this phenomenon and the rationale for really looking at it, where people are then talking about it. Why is she doing this? Why is kimchi Chinese or not? And why are we arguing about this? Okay. So Yiling, anyone else have a comment for Yiling, or any comments from her in turn? Okay, well, clearly we're going to go on. That is, we'll try to use all of your papers through the whole course. So we're doing this right at the beginning because we want to be able to do this as in an informed a manner as we can, and because this is such a small kind of working group that we can work together and talk about, well, how does Max Weber link to your topic, etc. Okay, so here we are going to. I'm down to Taylor Barrett. Taylor, can you talk to us?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Taylor. I'll start with a little bit about my background. I graduated from Northwestern with degrees in sociology and creative nonfiction writing. That was in 2012, though, so I'd taken time off to pursue, I I guess, a lifestyle of art making in Los Angeles. So I worked as a filmmaker, a comedy editor, a writer, a director, but I really missed academia. And so when I came back to academia, I was kind of stuck on this concept of work because I had made my way through so many different jobs in the years since I graduated from college. The jobs I listed are just some of the many jobs I had. I also had more.
I think you said you have 9 years after college. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I did so many other jobs too, retail jobs, web site design, marketing. I just did so many things. And it really made me curious about how we all seem to be trained to work, to become workers. And then I personally was just like, this really is the goal. Most of these jobs are personally intolerable. So that was just kind of the genesis personally. So then I joined this program and I tried to situate that question in the literature and in more scholarly conversations. So I am broadly interested in people's relationship to work, how they derive meaning from their jobs. I stumbled upon a community, depending on your view, you could call it an activist community, a social movement, or just a personal finance community called the FIRE community. It's Financial Independence, Retire Early. And these are people who are exasperated with the workforce, and they try to leave working as soon as they can. And they do that through strategic life design. At a basic level, they try to amass as much money as possible, invest that money, and then eventually earn so much money from the compound interest of their investments that they can forever sever their ties with the labor force. They no longer have to participate in mandatory labor. And so I'm doing a digital ethnography of 3 Facebook groups, 4 if I can get one Facebook group to get back to me, but 3 so far. And I'm interviewing people in the community, why they're participating in this lifestyle, which often calls for extreme frugality and some type of antisocial choices. But they're doing it often in a greater effort to just quit working. So yeah, the project has been going well. I've interviewed probably like 12 people so far. I'm hoping to interview more. And the reason I'm interested in taking this class is because there's so much of an emphasis on a culture of consumption. And that's one of the things that members of this community are really railing against for environmental reasons, for money reasons. So yeah.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. That's great presentation. And I'll just mention to illustrate the generality of that is the rise of consumption in contrast to just production has been going on in multiple ways. And so you do, unlike several, unlike most of the literature, I mean, there's some, and that's great. And you're looking at multiple sites. At the same time, how big and how many different literatures to include and how to reframe it, or reframe is too big. That is how to define the context, or how to look at variations in terms of this are open questions in ways which are great. So so I'd say you've done serious, and you've been obviously thinking about this for some of those 9 years. Okay. Durkheim said, science begins with comparison, that you don't know a phenomenon if you just talk to people who are in the middle of it and who are thinking parochially, and they only talk to you, why'd you storm the US Congress? Well, because it was there, or because it was painted red, or because, that is, you may get superficial brief comments, but if you can find other examples, we mentioned, for instance, ISIS or the looting that happened after the Black Lives Matter in the US 6 months ago, et cetera. And then compare, or Hong Kong, events going on, not just in Hong Kong, but in Myanmar this week, going on earlier in most of Syria, in Egypt. Clearly, we've got a big new, some places, new phenomenon of the degree to which we have activists actively trying to change the whole political process. So I'm mentioning now the generality of thinking in terms of the generality of your phenomenon. So your phenomenon, Taylor, you could say is now national policy of the Chinese government. The Chinese government, or that is most of the Asian, these fantastic countries, the four tigers, and then the big countries of China and Japan, they basically have mostly done production, export, planned, government-driven, state-controlled or highly regulated economic activities for 30, 40, 50 years. And it's been a brilliant success, but they're all now shifting to consumption. And they're saying, what the hell is consumption? And so that's a huge, global version of your same question. And so another one, which is central to our course, is the book by Jürgen Habermas, H-A-B-E. He's probably the most brilliant disciple of the Frankfurt School, sociology. He was a Marxist, and in some ways still clearly has strong Marxist foundations. But his big contrast was between England and the continent. And in England, you had in the coffee shops, coffee houses, you had people making political wagers, betting on your ship is not going to come in, my ship will. How much will you bet against me? That led to insurance companies. Then can I invest in, or what can I buy the contents of your ship? That led to the stock market. Then John Locke was and others were publishing little pamphlets which they'd circulate at these coffee shops, and people would say, "We want democracy," and others would say, "No, we don't," or and then someone else would, so they'd argue about it, and then they'd write new papers. On the continent, all this was illegal. If you tried to do that, you'd go to jail or be hung or kicked out of the country. And Karl Marx was kicked out of Germany from one town to the next. Then he went to Paris. He was kicked out of Paris. I think he went to Belgium for a little while. Then he went to England. And so in London, he could write the real Marxist stuff. And people said, if you want to work in the library, the British Museum, go ahead. And he did. Okay, so conversely, what were they talking about in those cafes, different word, in Versailles or Paris or Rome or Madrid? Anybody thought about that, especially you, Taylor? You heard this before? You know about the discussion? No, okay. The answer is basically consumption, lifestyle, and culture and the arts. That is, in the novels of Stendhal, and major French writer, the first half of the 19th century, nobody ever talks about work. They talk about, my reaction to that painting, or what a beautiful dress she was wearing, or other things which are not at all what were the core of the English coffee houses, which was basically work. So work versus leisure, consumption, lifestyle has been there for some time. The other obvious big thing is the aristocracy, which let's say in the Middle Ages, or the even before the Middle Ages, was meant to be the warrior class. I mean, they distinguished themselves by fighting on horseback, fighting in spears. I mean, war was their business. Then with the rise of nation states and so forth, the Renaissance, the Reformation, and then you get to the 18th, 19th centuries, they lost their job definition. So what did they do? They started writing chivalrous poetry, sort of like the continent. Who was the most famous early 19th century example of this, even inside England? Lord Byron. So Byron wrote the bestseller that's still used in American colleges and all around the world. He took the grand tour. He made his own grand tour, but it also included all kinds of lifestyle experiences which are not on the official grand tour, et cetera, et cetera. There was a biography of something like 900 pages, a biography of Byron that came out just a couple of years ago. And his own parents were aristocrats. He grew up in a highly aristocratic, closed sort of family situation. He did not go to those coffee shops in London where people were making the stock market. His parents thought about gambling, food and drinking, making love, and not much else. And there's 900 pages of that stuff. Okay, even in England, where this was not the normal pattern. So think about that if you're talking about, say, Chinese nationalism. Okay, I guess one can either say these are just irrelevant historical cases, I don't want to worry about them, but think then, how about another example? Asian, say Japanese, Chinese, the Japanese have been better documented in ways that I've seen, but we had an assistant professor here who was a Japanese specialist. And basically women who are highly educated, get a university degree, go to work, say in Japan for Toyota or one of the big trading companies, highly successful, then they get married and they have a child. What do they do after that for their career? Traditionally, at least, they'd never come back to work. Italy, basically the same way. Whereas in Northern Europe and the US, many women would mix work and family. And that leads to the kind of conflicts which you've got a lot of in your discussion. And this is relevant, I'm saying more because 2 or 3 of you are talking about feminism. And so gender roles and women's roles and how they've varied historically are a big issue. And there's a lot of cultural discussion of in the readings in our course. I'm mentioning Habermas is probably the most sophisticated and highly detailed. It's an excellent book. And it goes into the newspapers, the lifestyle, how does it spread, and so forth. But I'm suggesting this is a source of hypotheses, even if you don't want to use them as more than a line or even not a line in your papers at all. You could get ideas by reading about what Habermas saw in characterizing these kinds of things, as well as, as well as others that we'll see in the course. Okay, so I'm going, one more, I guess the most specific is, I tried to codify this in a book called The Cities and Entertainment Machine. And what I did was to read because most of the world has been, most people at places like the University of Chicago write about work, because we work a whole lot and we love it. We're the exception to your main thesis. Northwestern, I don't know about it, but at USC, Northwestern has big football stuff. They have football rallies. They have, parties around the football games. I mean, that's a visible part of Northwestern's institutional culture. USC, you know, work, work, work. Okay, that's our training here is terrible to try to resonate with what Taylor's talking about. Most of us may have never thought about this in our lives. Okay, given that, having her here saying there are a lot of people who don't want to be like you, what people are doing in Hyde Park. So it's great for all of us. It's great for all of our general education. At the same time that we've got to look, but I'm citing some examples of Asian women who live for their families as soon as they have a first child, or others who or say another big example, say the American military. Military men often can retire around age 38 or 40, and do so and love it. But what do they? I guess an unspoken statement, at least I think in what I read, was what do they do after they retire? I mean, if you retire at 30 or 35, what do you want to do, and what do they do for the rest of their lives? And is there any evidence on that from the things that you've read? Yeah, let me just listen to if you have an answer to any of that. Or let me. Why don't you just respond to any things that I've said? Because you've done a lot of work on this already. It's an excellent statement. Any thoughts that you want to leave the rest of us with to think about?
Well, thank you. I think, I've taken a lot of classes on work and labor studies. And yet I'm like right now having, new thoughts and things to look up. So like, this has been already really interesting. I think absolutely an implicit question is if work is the, an axis upon which a lot of identity is built, and which a lot of people develop a feeling of purpose, a sense of flow, which is what you're saying that the workers in this space generally feel with our labor. What does a retired person at age 30 do? And so I've had the chance to speak to a couple, and some of them have said they're bored. Most of them say that they're active and work when they want. So it seems to be kind of the work is less bothersome than just the lack of autonomy. But I want to definitely lean into that strain of questioning more.
When you say the work, is it being a non-paid member of a board of directors in which they do 20 hours a week, or is it something which they're paid for? That is, how many get additional jobs? Is there any data on that in some of your simple sources?
So far, the retired people I've spoken to take on consulting jobs and get paid for that. But also a lot of them talk about volunteer work.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But I guess what I'm probing with there, in a sense, and we're something I haven't introduced yet, is what are the causal processes? What kinds of dynamics might be going on here? And so I mentioned it in terms of hypotheses, but is the causal arrow going from capitalism to alienation to retiring young? Or is the causal arrow as Max Weber, and that's what most people said in 1890, 1880. Max Weber came along and he wrote a book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. He said the opposite. You know the argument, Taylor?
A little lightly.
Basically,
so, yeah.
Protestants of a specific, especially Calvinist Protestants, in their religion, and let me introduce. Max Weber was an economic historian. He had no specific interest in religion. He was trying to explain why did the West, especially England, develop industrial society way ahead, and why was it not India or China, which had 5,000-year-old civilizations, but they lagged the West in this major development of modern industrial society. Okay, so that's a huge topic. And so he studied it, and so he studied things like horseback riding, he studied capital investment, he studied banks, and then in a sort of early middle age, he came upon the idea of people have different propensities to work and engage themselves seriously, and he found in particular that Calvinist church members believed in frugality, hard work, and doing good works, not just making money. That is, capitalism was not greed. Capitalism was not making money with your family. That is, the family, the overseas traders from China were basically familistic. They worked together as a family, and they shared, they exchanged, they had trust, and so forth. So Weber said that's not capitalism, that's familism. But if you want to have this be large scale, you've got to build bigger than just your family. And so you needed to have also a more abstract sense of trust and of doing good works and having things that go beyond personal relationships. And so the combination of these, he then linked with Calvinist lifestyle, and that led to the creation of the ethic, the spirit of capitalism, which he measured or used as his main measure, the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. So statements like "a penny saved is a penny earned" is the spirit of capitalism. But why do you say that? And so, and that is, it implies be frugal, don't waste your money. Whereas the Neapolitan waiter or the aristocrats in Versailles or London would do the opposite. They'd spend more money than they had because they wanted to have new dresses, new cars, new buildings, new homes, new gardens, etc. So in that sense, Weber basically is that is, if you're trying to make a serious causal linkage, you ought to bring in something like Max Weber, for instance. Or so the general point I'm taking a little more time because this is a general point for almost all of you. Don't just think of X leads to Y, think of Y leads to X. Maybe you got the causal arrow going the wrong way. Or maybe they both are going on over time to some degree, in which case, how can you analyze that? So Yiling has got her fancy quantitative measures of doing this potentially. But for most of it, you're talking about more ethnographic work. You could ask people. That is, you could ask, are you a Calvinist? Or what did you think about, what do you think about work? And for instance, some people may say, I retired at 30, but I felt so guilty that I wasn't contributing good works to the world that I got a new full-time job. A lot of people from the American military do that. Or Bill Gates, or Jimmy Carter. They retire as president, in 70s, 80s. Jimmy Carter is out there doing good works in his mind. Bill Gates is spending his life trying to figure out how to help the poor people in the entire world. He's not just building mansions or sailing on a yacht and being, showing off his money. He's doing the opposite. So that's, in that sense, bringing in these alternative potential interpretations with those illustrated by those examples. And if you're only it depends on your research design. And so in your case, Taylor, you could have a combination of these. You could bring in multiple interpretations and then try to test them and reject them or support them to some degree based on a census data, national surveys, all kinds of things. But then say, my original focus will be on interviewing a small number of people. Or you could do 50-50. That is, all of you. So think about, you could spend half of your thesis or all of your thesis reviewing the literature. That's your choice. And for some things, there's so much literature and it's so subtle and complicated. You're going to learn, you could learn a lot more by reading and thinking about it than talking to 10 or 20 or 30 or surveying 200 people, which in a superficial survey. Okay, options. Anything else you want to ask or Taylor or people ask of her? Okay, great.
Yeah, you have a question, Santao?
I do have a kind of interest. I was really interested by your topic. It's kind of reminds me of my own thesis partially because there is a element of like elite proletarian class, like elite workers in the society. So their perception of work is so much different from like people maybe working for Walmart in a front stores and whatever. So like I'm wondering how I consider that like in your thesis. It's very interesting. Yeah.
I really like that point because just in popular culture, this movement has gotten a lot of criticism for being only achievable by an elite class of workers, mainly like tech workers or engineers, because the higher your income, the sooner you can effectuate the plan to retire early. But I've seen that at least in the boards that I'm following, there are workers from all different stratas of society, like firemen and house cleaners. It mainly is populated by people who have bigger incomes, but I'm talking to nurses and content analysts, people who are not making giant sums of money annually. But I still have more interviews to conduct, but I think it's a great thing to keep in mind.
Okay. Let's see.
Can I ask Taylor a quick question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sci-fi, thank you. So is FIRE a community while people are strategizing, in preparation for early retirement, or is it also a community once they, achieve their financial goal and are able to exit the workforce?
It seems to be mainly a support group for people on their FIRE journeys. Definitely there are more people like on this journey than there are currently retired people. I've heard from a couple retired folks that they feel a little isolated in now that they've reached like the kind of end stage of the FIRE journey. So it mainly seems to be a space where people cheer one another on and give support. And yeah, but I hope to interview more retired people. It's harder to find them though. Yeah.
Okay. We want to take a break pretty soon. We're near, let's see, we're 4:20, 40. What we do? Let's do one more presentation. Lena, would you want to talk?
Yes, I can share. So I guess I'll start out with a short history of myself. So my family moved to California, the Bay Area, and that's from Germany. That's where I grew up. After high school, I went back to Germany to do my undergrad. And I did my bachelor's in political science and sociology. And then I wrote my bachelor thesis in sociology. I wrote it on multiculturalism and transculturalism in regards to Apodorai's globalization theory. I'm pretty sure I pronounced his name wrong, but not sure how to. And then that was 2020, and then I started the program here. And 2019, I did an internship in the German consulate in New York. And that was a very interesting experience for me because having myself, where I grew up in the US, I had like a very different perspective than those German diplomats that were there and whose job was to interact with these Americans and establish like successful interactions and communication. And even though like they were supposed to be like kind of experts and pass along like information to Germany about the current state of New York and surrounding area, I felt like there was a lot of kind of cultural like misunderstandings just from my perspective. So that's kind of what I wanted to discuss further in my thesis. So I'm trying to look at, I want to interview German diplomats and want to look at how they're navigating this space in between in between cultures. So I started out with like looking at kind of Schutz's like stranger kind of theory, and felt, and also like there's like others too, but it feels like diplomats aren't really like the stranger, because they aren't really trying to assimilate, but they do want to understand this other culture. So it's I feel it's a very interesting space that they're in, and I want to try to get a closer look at that. And so I'm taking this class to learn more about like yeah, like culture, and gain a deeper insight like what makes a culture, how maybe to how different cultures interact, how to become part of another culture, and what keeps you from getting into that other culture, kind of boundaries, like that kind of stuff.
Okay, this is what am I? I'm getting double. Let me turn my volume down a little bit. Lots of big things overlap with this, maybe almost too much, in the sense of assimilation, globalization, multiple identities, personality dimensions, role conflict, social status conflict. That is, there are lots of literatures which bear on this in some way. So I would say, think for yourself, how much are you interested in the bigger, more general themes that you have ticked off? And or do you really want to study German diplomats or diplomats in New York, or more generally? Or and there's no one right. I mean, each of you've got to ask and answer questions like that yourselves. But I'm just throwing out these broader options. And even if you don't change your focus, at least reading some of the cultural theories and examples and interpretations, like the two kinds of coffee consumption on the continent and in England, can give you, especially within England, the disparity between the Byron family and the surrounding hardworking people building up Calvinist industrialism was huge. So the Byrons lost their money over time pretty quickly, but there were others who replaced them. So in that sense, I don't think I don't mean to press you to try to answer how broad do you want it to be. I would say the reason most of you are here is that you are interested in looking at multiple ways of thinking about this. But the smart thing, and many of your personal biographies illustrate this, is you've got exposure to multiple, very deeply distinctive cultures or subcultures, especially nations. But the same thing can happen if you move as I did. I lived in New England. I lived in the American South. I lived in California, and the culture shock of living in just these different regions of the US was huge as I was growing up. So either, and then cross nationally all the more. I guess a corollary would be to try to maybe identify, and this is now we're getting to the second topic, so we're moving the second big theme, and we've been through probably more than half of you already, but what we can look at are sort of models of framing and theorizing and drawing causal arrows or things like that. That is, in a sense, I mean, the prior to that is the question of what am I studying? What's the dependent variable? That's the normal way of framing it. What do I want to explain? You can instead say, what's the independent variable? That is, if it's, say, capitalism, what is capitalism creating, or what is being a diplomat? What does diplomatic experience transform in your life? Or did you choose to become a diplomat because you felt you didn't want to be part of any culture? You're sort of implicitly suggesting that because you're a diplomat, that's the causal driver. But I'm asking, from knowing a number of friends who've been diplomats in and out of it and so forth, that it may be that because they like being expats and so forth, they deliberately don't want to be in a village in England or a small German town. They want to be in a New York or Belgrade or whatever and lead a different life. And there are huge numbers of especially British novels on this. The literature on the life of expats around the British Empire is and the wild lives which they led. That's a classic bestseller theme, as you some of you probably know. Okay, and maybe there's a German counterpart literature as well. Any ways you want to any ways that you want to sort of respond to any of that, either Lena yourself or anybody else who wants to join with you on that is framing the multiple identities and the multiple subcultures is a good alternative in a sense to the framing that we have with Wenman. That is, Wenman is talking about Chinese nationalism, and that almost implies there's one thing, whereas you're Lena, you're starting from almost the opposite position. That is being a German and being a diplomat distinctive, or being a diplomat what's most important, and that is there are multiple dimensions which may lead one to say, I don't know who I am because I'm living in so many different countries. I see so many right and wrong ways of doing things. You can go to jail in one country for doing what you have to do in another country, and so forth. So in a sense, you've got too many topics. But on the other hand, if you decide how you want to focus on them, for instance, is it more psychological? Is it more abstractly cultural? Is it more where and why do the subcultures potentially combine with one another? So it's going to be a question of taste for all of you to think about how to answer questions of that sort. And we've got multiple competing answers in the readings in the course, which is great. Any comment on any of that, Lena, or you want to wait and see?
I'm good right now, but I do realize it's pretty broad still, so I really hope to get some like clarity, hopefully, in this course, and try to focus in on what exactly I'm looking at.
Okay, well, that's great. What if we take a we can see that is, because even though we're at home, you can starve in 3 hours. So feel free to bring back some food, or to bring food from the beginning if you want a snack or drink, or if you're drinking beer, maybe try to keep or alcohol, try to keep it not too visible, or in terms of how it may shift your conversation, unless you want to demonstrate or try something out. But food is great, and non-alcoholic beverages are fine. But whatever else is on the side, we won't probe about. But what if we aim? Okay, so we're now at 5:50. Maybe that's an easier way if we so it's 5, and then we go to 7:20. So if we break around 6. What if we break for say roughly 10 minutes, but start to come back in the last 5, and then we can sort of, and then really take off again at 6:15. Does that make sense? Yeah, that we've done various things like this in the past in terms of what I'll just add. I had one course with Daniel Bell, and we'll add that it took a break in the middle like this. And what happened in the break was phenomenal, because his course was called Marxism, and it attracted top people from the Communist Party of the United States, whose headquarters was in Manhattan. They were trying to recruit the smart students, And then you had all kinds of Marxist activists and union organizers arguing with each other. And during that break of 10, 15 minutes, wow, were there things of power going on? So that afterward could lead to dinners and discussions. And I was involved in the middle of all of that. It's a first-year graduate student. So let's take a 15-minute break. And if you can bring back something new and refreshing intellectually, or even in food, tell us about it. Okay, let's take our little break. And you can leave your picture on, but you don't need to, whatever you like. You're going to present now, Wenmin, please. Wenmio?
It's me or Wenbin?
Yeah, you please.
Yeah. So so my topic, I'm from China. I received my BA in China, and then I went to Hong Kong and did my first master degree in political economy. Then I came to Chicago. I'm a MAP student, and my research interest is about Chinese nationalism. And thanks so much, Professor Clark. I think Professor has already mentioned too much about my research topic. So so I like to add more about my research question. I hope to start like researching nationalism by looking at a language approach to analyzing online narratives, because I think that today it's hard for us to distinguish a real nationalist from fake nationalist, because when I was researching online communities, I found that like nationalism can be very complex. Many of them, it can be a patriotism, communism, and even something about fandom. Like many Chinese like fans, they will use nationalism as one of their like weapon to fight against other like celebrity or others. So this is my original research interest. So later when I took a course in winter, like last quarter, is about language and culture. I learned like concepts like registers, voices, and romanticization. So I think that we see or feel nationalism in online communities, or even feminism, because those people, they talk or they behave or they talk or they write as a nationalist or feminist. So I hope to analyze online narratives to help me understand nationalism in online communities, and especially when it comes to the controversy about kimchi. So I think Professor Clark has mentioned about like this YouTuber who is very popular and famous in China. Her name is Li Ziqi. So the kimchi controversy is is one of the most recent nationalistic debate in Chinese online communities. So Li Ziqi, she is actually one of the most popular cultural icon who has over 14 million subscribers. So she's right now caught in a social media war between Korean and Chinese netizens. So he's famous because she make videos about rural life in China. So last year in December, she posted a 20-minute video on YouTube where she showed how she made kimchi. However, it is this video that brings forth an existing and prolonged cultural debate over the origin of kimchi and other controversial cultural symbols, such as a hanbok, or whether it should be hanfu, the Chinese traditional clothes. So I like to use these like online debate in Douban, my viewpoint, which is a social media platform similar to Weibo, but not that similar to like Twitter or other social media. So to analyze nationalism, especially how Chinese nationalism is linguistically constructed, in order to answer that, to what degree that can such online community echo people's real life, and what kind of implications that we can gain from this example to know how communication or how people's national identity got shaped under an authoritarian power regime. That's it.
Excellent. Well, succinct, focused. What we've had several conversations. I guess I'll say, in terms of continuing some of the more general themes, which I'm trying to do, commenting on things which apply to many of you. What's the logic of what you have in your statement and orally? Most of it is definitional. What is Chinese nationalism? Is it linguistic? Is it is it food? Is it the discourse about the food? Is it the symbolism of fighting with Korea, which is, as the Koreans say, kimchi is the national Korean food, and the Chinese are saying, no, it's Chinese. Okay, why is that so important in China and maybe in Korea? I don't know what the counterpart discussions are going on there, but that is, what are the logical things which you might do next? One is to, and what you did last quarter was to really deeply dive into the linguistic, or let's say the more general language related definitions of nationalism. And so you have, for instance, remitization and one or two things like that. On the other hand, what you do not have is how does this relate to nationalism? But I'm asking this because I know you've worked on this. You've worked hard on this for a long time. You've looked at things like national surveys from the that is, you have national surveys of Chinese nationalism. You don't have a word on that here. That is, how could you connect bigger studies of Chinese nationalism, either in the data, as I'm mentioning there, or theorizing? That is, what are the theoretical approaches to Chinese nationalism for the last 5,000 years? Big, simple question. So if you can bracket it a bit and somehow narrow it, I'll simply add that I'm talking not just to Wen Mao, but since we published a book called Scenescapes, and it came out in Chinese about a year and a half ago. Just a few weeks ago, the national government and its party activists embraced our scenes ideas and placed it officially in the 5-year plan of China, that we will try to create more scenes and consumption lifestyle in Chinese cities. And so that grew out of the fact that we have a Scenes Academy in China, and I'm talking every couple of weeks with Chinese persons about concepts like tradition and what is Chinese tradition, as we've been talking about for a long time. And it's a lot more difficult because China's got 5,000 years and not just short history like the US or new countries. So maybe arbitrarily saying, I'm going to define it this way, but then try to say, what else do you want to do? I mean, do you really want to just stop there, as you implicitly are doing in your statement? Or do you want to say who and where and why is nationalism stronger within China? Has it gone up with the new style of President Xi? Has it gone down? Has it gone up with some and down with others? How much is it, as you're also implied in what you said, a what should we call this? It's not quite the color of your glasses. It's more the accent with which you, or the framing, I guess we can call the framing of Kim Xi can be part of Chinese nationalism, or it can be just part of should you put what raw ingredients do you put into the pot to combine into Kim Xi? That is, how does Kim Xi become so important as a Chinese nationalist topic? And if you try to say why, then you could, I mean, the why can be the rise of nationalism in general. It can be different for subgroups and maybe closer to the Proud Boys that we heard of. I mean, the Proud Boys and the American nationalism, American law, American constitutional, etc., political correctness. I mean, many kinds of arguments around that could be potentially linked here. Several of you have also have a background in international relations. IR theory was realism for many decades. In the last 10, 20 years, they've added explicitly nationalism. So where and how does nationalism interact with the size of the that is, the classic factors were geographic proximity, military strength in terms of numbers of tanks and troops and so forth. And third, the economic strength of the country. And those would determine where and how you would fight with one country or stay away because you were geographically more distant from. Okay, by adding nationalism to that, IR is potentially dramatically changed, but even the top IR theorist here at Chicago writes books and publishes books which have nothing to do with any of those three things. So thinking of where and how, so his answer in a sense is, I bring in this only when I'm trying to do my IR theorizing, but I recognize that empirically, there are many other factors going on. The economists talk about ceteris paribus, other things equal, and they do a lot. I mean, they make very tight theories compared to the other social sciences, but they leave out more than, say, anthropology, which is a discipline, tends to be more holistic, or the ethnographic experience of looking at what's everything going on in a traditional, quote, community study or small group, a single primary group. So you can go in the direction of the economists and say, here are 5 causal steps about where and why nationalism operates and why it's important, and that may link to your political economy MA and literature. Or you can just go into one in more detail and explore it. Or you could embellish and combine these in various ways. So I'm in a sense now near the beginning of the course, and most of you are wanting to finish probably in the summer, something like that. We haven't asked that question, but if that's roughly the time perspective, you've got to pretty much get your topic pretty clear and have your framework pretty well spelled out this quarter. So that's why this is good timing for thinking and trying to get answers to those questions. So these are not just empty questions. And I know from our conversations with Wen Meo, you're taking them very seriously. So anyone else have questions or comments of Wen Meo? And then do you have anything you want to fold into the discussion more generally?
Yeah, I do have a question. So I I remember you briefly mentioned the authoritarian regime. So it's kind of in this debate, you see people from authoritarian regime arguing with people from a democratic country. So it's like how well that element play out here. It's kind of, because I feel nationalism does not only belong, like, because I feel like I personally feel like South Korea is really a nationalist country. So how I will take that account into the factor like authoritarianism on nationalism.
So I don't think I focus too much on the authoritarian regime, because for me, I think nationalism in online communities cannot be analyzed in a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach, because there are diverse social actors engaged in online debates. So, but I do agree with you, like it can be a dialogue between Chinese nationalists and Korean nationalists. But if, like, from what I learned in linguistic anthropology, it's, we actually don't I mean, this approach actually did not like look too much take a very deep look at the regime itself, but more about how Korean netizens and Chinese netizens talk about kimchi. For example, in Chinese communities, both Weibo or in our daily life, people will use like bangs, such a vocabulary to describe Korean people. However, so how Korean netizens, they use similar word to describe Chinese. So because of this word, we regard them as pieces of registers. We say they are nationalists. So this is, I think this does not have too much relationship with the regime itself, but I do agree with you that the authoritarian regime influence how people speak out these registers, as I said before. And also, I personally also question how much influence that internet has on online activism, because I previously think that internet is very important for promoting nationalism, especially for the central government, because we have many official accounts in Weibo or in many other social platforms that the central government manipulate official accounts as their throat to express nationalism, or at least whip up nationalist emotions in online communities. However, I recently read a book called Soul Stealers. In Chinese, we call the book 教魂. So this book said that back to Qing Dynasty, the year 1768. So when no internet or no social media platform, but people still can promote some ideology quickly across China in a very quick speed under authoritarianism. So I also hope to use this research to find answers about how much influence that internet can have on people's daily life. I don't know whether this answer a question, but please let me know if you think this is unclear.
Maybe just to try to articulate your answer, how much are you using in your own mind Chinese nationalism as a cause, as a consequence, as related to something else? And what do you, and does that relate to some hypotheses which you might try to make more explicit?
So I think if we look at Chinese nationalism from a top level, that is from the level of the central government, I do think nationalism has been emphasized or highlighted since President Xi took power in 2013. I think that my hypothesis is that nationalism is strategically manipulated by the Chinese government, which is quite obvious by their like assertive diplomatic attitudes, especially when it comes to territorial disputes, such as the South China Sea dispute in 2016. So this is how I see nationalism at the top level. So if we see nationalism from the bottom level, say in online communities, how netizens express their political interview regarding nationalism, I'm not so clear about it right now because I think it's quite complicated. So I hope to use the kimchi controversy as a start, like for me to delve into nationalism in online forums.
Okay. Anyone else have a comment or question? All right. Well, thank you, Enmyo. Taylor, I'm scrolling down. We did Taylor Barrett. Scrolling down. Lots of text from Taylor here. I pasted her on your notes. Theo, okay, Theo has spoken. Has anyone else sent a statement and okay, yeah, GHN, here we go. Women's movement. Would you like to talk to us about it?
Yeah, sorry. So a little personal background. I went to UCSD for my undergrad and I had a major in sociology. During my years at UCSD, I have studentmates working in Women's Center and often organize protests for female workers' rights. So when in 2017 and 18, I saw there's an online movement called Me Too movement in China. I was very happy to see that women could speak up and bring discussion of the stigmatization of women who have experienced like sexual harassment or assaults, and the discussion of the rejection of the male gaze and other issues related to women's rights and gender equality into public on social media. And this is why I wanted to switch my research topic to do feminist movement in China. The public keeps talking about women's rights on the social media in the following days, and there are lots of events relating to feminism happening, and a lot of both governmental and non-governmental organizations recognize the low cost of entering social media and the publicity of social media. So they started to use the platforms like Weibo and Douban, as Wenmeo mentioned, to help the females in need and educate them to build proper views on gender. In my view, social media plays a very important role in feminist movement in China. On one hand, it provides the organizations in China an alternative space to flourish and allow women to build the individual and the organizational relationship and communicate in the kind of safe space, because before the online activism started, a lot of civil associations about female rights in China, they're small in scale and are mostly like self-funded. They couldn't like organize activities offline. So the social media offer these organizations an opportunity to educate the woman and organize some activities online. But on the other hand, China has strict censorship on social media. Mostly, they are targeting on issues like progressive issues about maybe like splitting up the country or something like that. So when the feminist movement become a little more progressive and when it looks a little like the women tried overrun the patriarchy order, there are some speeches that might have been like censored. And the complex. So there are some misogynist also in the social media and try to attack the woman who wants to speak up and engage in feminist movement. So regarding the complexity of online spaces as fields for collective action, I want to investigate how the grassroots organizers perceive social media as battlefield and how the individuals perceive social media as a tool in improving gender inequality. And I took your global local politics last quarter and urban social movement. So I guess these two courses have some materials about social movement that gave me the background to and lead me to this research topic. That's it.
Okay. Questions I have are, how about any literature or hypotheses? If you've had two courses that touch on this.
I haven't had any like hypothesis because I have just changed my topic like last week. So, but I have read some literature on the Chinese censorship and the Me Too movement 2018 as background.
Okay, I'd say maybe one thing, if you've had who taught the course on social movements you taught? You took?
Professor William Seitz.
Okay. Well, how about going through the literature of the global local politics? I think we had a session. Yeah, we had a session. The first session, second session of the year was on social movements, and we went through some of the classic literature and then the more recent and the disparities and many different ways of conceptualizing, studying, and what you're discussing in China is could fit with either of those in various ways. Let me just give you one example of that, and this is, I mean, what feminism is one of the big issues in the current debates nationally, internationally about diversity, and so there's a huge amount of public commentary, writing from the serious to the unserious, but I mean, lots of smart people are writing and thinking about this in ways that was not happening before. For instance, the president of Northwestern, an economist and a professor of literature at Northwestern, who just published a new book saying that most of the discussions over these kinds of issues are happening in such a rhetorically emotional, quasi-religious manner that it's very hard to do science. So what I'm trying to do is help us talk about these because these are big, important issues. At the same time, to say how well can we address them with at least some of the more traditional scientific approaches, or approaches that may not be so scientific, but still, for example, could include novels. So I've tried to use not just what social scientists are doing, but use novelists to get subtle ways of looking at these issues. A famous example was Simone de Beauvoir did a book called The Second Sex in the 1950s, I guess it was, in France. So she wrote a novel about these, essay combination / novel. In a country at a time when there was virtually no feminism. So in that sense, feminism is a new issue in many parts of the world, but where and how it emerged, for instance, on opposite sides of the channel, that is what I said with Habermas, women were the center of lots of writing in the 19th century in France, for instance, in Italy, Spain, in ways that the stock market, insurance companies' work were not. And so the way you would approach the king in Versailles would be to deal with aspects which may have something to do with ballet or love life, or affairs which people were having with each other in all those rooms in the huge castles around Versailles. I mean, that was big stuff. And they attracted Catherine the Great from Russia. They attracted people from all over the world, say the Western, mostly Eastern Western European world, and Latin America as well to some degree, to come to there. And as Habermas stressed in great detail, themes that were seen as dominated by women were the main discourse of everyone. So I guess I'm saying, look at that simple kind of statement of Habermas with the careful historical scrutiny which he gives it. He does content comparisons of what were the themes of magazines, newspapers over the 19th century and into the 20th century on the European continent versus England, for instance. And so I'm in that sense, many of these issues are not new, but what can we learn from comparison? And conceptualization of changing gender roles, which have been going on for some time. Okay. Habermas as well, of course, has strong hypotheses. And one more I'll just flag, as this overlaps with several of you, is the background which may be seen initially as Marxist, coming from the Frankfurt School. I mean, what the Frankfurt School said, in some ways, they would summarize their perspective, was a combination of Marx with Freud. So Freud, in that sense, was a way of relating men and women together. And how did that join with Marx? And so you had many different takes on this by Adorno, by Horkheimer, by later on Habermas. But you also had one of the smartest who actually did not do his PhD with the people at Frankfurt, but his name was Walter Benjamin. How many of you have read anything by Benjamin? Okay, one. Well, Benjamin's has a huge book published finally called the Archive Project, but it basically drew on the poetry mostly and some of the essays of the most important general intellectual in France at the end of the 19th century. Who was that? Baudelaire, the poet. And his main girlfriend was a prostitute in the streets of Paris. And so he wrote much of the poetry about her perspective on street life. And then, okay, so let me just point to that and saying that why was this important? Benjamin wrote this book because he wanted to understand how did Paris become a highly successful city wherein it had no industrialization. They started to build a factory in Paris in 1802 or so forth. People said, oh, stop, you're going to have smoke. We can't have any smoke in Paris. So they managed instead to have wine, cheese, dresses, shoes, umbrellas, pretty dresses, style, elegant lifestyle, the things which Versailles had been doing for centuries became cultural policy and central issues as have been explicitly embraced in China very recently, officially and explicitly, but these have been there in the court life at least, also in China and in Japan and Korea for hundreds of years. And the roles of women specifically in courts and around the court life of these countries shouldn't be left out, is what I'm suggesting. Especially for you, those several of you from Asia. Okay, and you, okay. There's a lot of literature on the these Asian cases. It's up to you whether and how much you want to use the bigger, broader. But in another way, some of what two or three of you have framed as individual choices. Should I retire at 35 or not? How do I talk about cooking kimchi? And am I going to join, or will I be part of the Me Too movement or not? Those are sort of frames individualistically, which we more often do in the West than in Asia. But in a more collectivist perspective, one could ask more generally, where and why do we have an emergence of the Me Too movement? Where and why instead did that not emerge in France, and why did it emerge first in Protestant countries? Where and how did women's rights and human rights become central after World War II? And what was the Chinese, or let's say some of the non-Western conceptualizations, and was that important? So I guess what I'm doing is trying to say there are literatures and there's serious, useful results. For instance, I'll just give you one concrete result. In the New Political Culture book, which I think's on our reading list here, we wanted to measure and compare cities in terms of the degree to which they had women mayors and percentage of women council members as a measure of what? We weren't quite sure, but something to do with women being treated more equally, and which could vary by city and by country. And so we found to simplify, we found two big results. One was in the US, you tended to have things like Me Too or a civic group. And if you had citizens who were more highly educated, you tended to have more active civic groups, and they would then implement more, they would elect more women as council members and as mayors. Think of places like Ann Arbor, Seattle, Madison, Wisconsin, etc. By contrast, and say years ago, now this is more widespread. By contrast, the dynamic of where and why are women, so in a sense, that's an individualistic linked with civic group activity, which is a more Tocquevillian interpretation. Instead, in the most visible example is Eastern Europe and Italy, where in the last decade or so before 1989, with the end of the falling of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, and the role of the party role of communism, the Communist Party had people voting for it, and those towns which had more communists elected they decided and they implemented 50% of all council members were women. So that the driver had nothing to do with gender equality. The driver was party politics. And that is, and so what you had in a number of those towns were blue collar workers, less educated men and women who may have been totally opposed to gender equality of having all these city council members who were women. But they still said, I could only vote for the Communist Party, and I always will. And then they may not have realized in advance how many women they would get. But you had these kinds of conflicts I'm pointing out between left, right, gender, party, and they had, and so in that sense, that's a more collective institutional dynamic, not something which fits more with personality, social background. And each of these are, in different contexts, variously valid explanations of where and why women are elected as mayors or council members. Make sense? Okay. Okay, so think about the bigger, broader ways, and we'll see this in the readings as we proceed, of reconceptualizing what you may want to focus on. Anything anyone else wants to add? As yeah, we're missing, we got one more. The red pill. Where's that red pill coming in here?
Well, that's me.
That's you. Okay.
Yeah, I might have gotten mixed up with the other tail.
Okay. Well, as you're so close, unless we have anything else from Jie, anything else you want to add or ask Jie before we push on to, I mean, a very similar topic, and then we can discuss more as we proceed. But why don't we go on with? I mean, I love the label. Let's go on with a red pill.
Okay. So I'm also in the MAPS program, and my background, I'm in the BA MA program. So I'm currently in MAPS, but I was also here at UChicago for my undergrad. And I was a sociology major, and also a media arts and design minor. So I have a bit of background in media studies as well. And I've been looking at the Manosphere, which is a group of anti-feminist men's identity communities online, on various social media platforms like Reddit, 4chan, and YouTube. And central to a lot of these communities is the red pill, which comes from the Matrix, but it's used to describe a very misogynistic worldview that uses sort of an evolutionary psychology framework to claim that women are naturally manipulative and self-interested. And I've been interested in looking at what draws people to these communities and what leads them to accept those claims. And in working to answer that, I've been interested in the self-help framing of a lot of red pill content, especially because a lot of journalistic accounts of the red pill focus on it as sort of a political movement, and its ties to the far right. But a lot of red pill content presents itself as sort of apolitical self-help material with advice about things like exercise, dating, and confidence. So I've been interested in exploring the relationship between those different aspects of the manosphere, and understanding the role of self-help framing in the proliferation of those ideas. And I've been conducting interviews with viewers of red pill content, some current and some former, focusing on what led them to accept or reject those ideas. And I have seen that self-help presentation is a big aspect of that, as they largely come to accept red pill ideas because they're accompanied by personal advice and a framework for understanding their dissatisfactions. And I'd say something that I'm especially interested in looking at in this class is the relationship between subcultures and mainstream culture, especially because I've been looking a lot at sort of the understanding red pill ideas as sort of an extension of more pervasive cultural ideas. So I'd like to understand how the two interact. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's great. And so it's a similar topic of big changes in gender roles, but at the same time you overlap. I mean, we've got a lot of themes which overlap with well, what have called elsewhere new social movements, or new definitions of subgroups. So the one quick comment I wrote after I read your statement was, are you familiar with the idea, but you mentioned it right at the end, of the so-called two-step flow of communication from Elihu Katz, Paul Lazarsfeld? They have a book called Personal Influence. No,
I'm not.
Yeah, probably most of you are not. So let me just briefly say that several of you are using social media and mass media as major sources of evidence, and then trying to link it to something else. The main view from the Frankfurt School and many others in the 1930s and 40s was that the new media, especially radio in the 30s, and then in the 50s, television, would have huge propagandistic effects, and film, of course, movies, and that people would do what they were told, or that an ideal, an attractive ideal would be something that other people would want to join with. This led in the 40s to the first serious scientific studies of mass communication, and they were led by Paul Lazarsfeld at Columbia, with the president of the Columbia Broadcasting Company, because they own CBS, they wanted to know, we wanted to be able to show advertisers that we're having an impact, or how much of an impact are we having? The advertisers, or other people would say viewers, government regulators. This is a hot issue. Are you really propagandizing and changing and opposing government policy or not? And this is debated right now in Washington with the big tech firms. How much was the fact that then President Trump's broadcasting rights on Twitter were taken away by the Twitter company? Okay, so in a sense, that's censorship by a private corporation over the President of the United States. Okay, so in that sense, how big is the impact of the tweet from the president alone? In the 30s and 40s, most people said it's huge. What the main simple result of a lot of research was, it was much smaller than people thought. That there were lots of other dynamics going on. Big ones were self-selection. You choose to join Me Too, or you choose to join a Chinese nationalist web group because you are a nationalist. And you may not change by virtue of talking to those other people at all. You may not change your values. Same thing was true, say, it's roughly at the same time in the 50s, the social psychologist Theodore Newcomb were trying to say, how much does college change people's values? Do you become more liberal in a very liberal college or not? And the main finding of hundreds of these studies was no, most people don't change their values at all. And there was one huge exception, which was Bennington College in Bennington, Vermont. There's a little bit of politics in that town, which is carried on up to present. But the point is, where do people change their views, and how much do these make a difference? And so what then Katz and Lazarsfeld did, looking not just at colleges, but at general media, about news coverage, about shopping, about advertising. Do you buy those things which are marketed more? And their basic answer was the two-step flow of communication. That is, if you have, say, 5 women who shop for clothes together on Saturday afternoon, week after week after week, they'll have lunch. They'll talk about, oh, that's a nice new purse. Where did you get that? How's your husband and his problem, which he was having with, et cetera, and so forth. They talk to, then they become close friends. And then maybe late in the afternoon, one will say, by the way, who are you going to vote for? And most people, and so in their examples, often 4 of the 5 would say, I don't know, but they'd look at the person, the one person in the group who really read the political news, but who shared their deep values on many other things. And they would be influenced heavily by that one person. So the idea is the two-step flow is that one person would read the newspaper, talk to people, do a lot of research, think about it, not because this was officially done, but just as a personal style, personal interest. And it may be that another person would be a specialist on shoes. A third person might be more interested in cooking. And so they each might have different areas they talk about and bring to that conversation. But Lazarsfeld was Viennese. He came from Austria, and he came up with this theory when he came to America, because in Austria, he'd been a Marxist activist trying to engage people to join the left, the Socialist Party, in the Marxist Socialist Party in Vienna. He came here and he said, what Americans really care about is how to advertise or eat tomato soup and how women shop for red shoes versus blue shoes. Politics is part of consumption. So if that was his reaction in the 1930s, do we ever have more of this today? So thinking thus in the way which they framed it there, and I'll just mention 3 names. Gabriel Tarde in 1890 wrote about this in Arguing with Durkheim. He has a famous paper called Conversation. The co-author of Lazarsfeld, who I mentioned, is Elihu Katz, who has a great book on Tarde's ideas, and he has about couple of 100 propositions which come from that essay, specific, clearly stated. Then he has a review of the literature about each of these dynamics and how they work. It's published by, I think, the University of Pennsylvania, Annenberg School of Communication, where he's a professor. He used to be here in sociology. And the third person is Bruno Latour, Latour. He's a French theorist, he's a sociologist, I think, who worked on science initially. So we had one paper here on science. Latour had a very almost anti-scientific view of clientelism, hierarchy, domination, that science is not the advance in knowledge. Science is just who you can push around in your lab. And so over his career, Bruno Latour changed his view. And he said that's one kind of lab and one kind of context in some of what may sound like science, but there are other types which follow different rules. So that's the more general lesson which I would say we can take away in a lot of these literature reviews, is not that there's one right answer waiting for you to find it, but that there are multiple different answers depending on how you want to frame your questions in your MA. And you can choose, and at this stage, you can read these broader themes and theories and then try to see how they may connect, or if it's something you want to pursue further, whether it's feminism in China or your red pill. Okay, that's probably my main comment, which is obviously generalizing beyond just yours. I look forward to learning more about this. Well, another big one, I guess, is put forth is macho. The whole idea of macho is major in much of the world. And where and how is that being actively countered? And one place where it was very visible was the election of Vicente Fox in Mexico. He became president of, he ran for the first time against the party that dominated Mexican politics, the Revolutionary Party, for most of the 20th century. End of the 20th century, Vicente Fox ran against them. He defeated it's like the Communist Party being defeated in Eastern Europe. And one of his big themes was attacking the idea of macho, and that heightened a style of personalistic drug gangs, murders, and that it was perpetuated by the mothers of many sons, and the mothers were the problem more than the red pill. Okay, so these debates, I'm just flagging this as going on around the world in ways that are very visible, very hot, or just look at um, Clinton versus Trump in their election, which you're old enough to remember that, I think. That the battle there was over many of Trump being this ostensibly active macho type, and physically or literally attacking the physical gender of his opponent, saying you're not tough enough to be president. I mean, that would just be considered totally politically incorrect until Trump said that. But it shows how these themes or how they interpenetrate in ways that one can try to analyze. What if we have we missed anybody who hasn't spoken? Yes, tell us. Did you send us a statement? We been who?
I didn't send a statement because I do not have a research project per se for the class. I'm considering taking the class as an introductory class.
Okay.
Should I do a brief introduction of
Sure.
myself?
Why don't you just briefly introduce yourself? That's fine.
Right. I did my undergrad. I just graduated last May in philosophy and East Asian language and cultures from University of Southern California. So I'm planning from humanities, which is different from other people. And here I'm taking classes. I had previously taken classes in cinema and media studies and East Asian civilizations. So last quarter, I took a class which talks about a combination of Badiou's culture theory with the Chinese literati society. And I think it's very interesting and provides fresh ideas. So I just want to branching out to study the protection of culture from the social science perspectives. And I'm interested in various forms of culture protection within specific regions and forming how do people form cultural identities.
Okay, well that's great. Anybody else we missed? No. Okay.
I'm the only.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah. Do you guys see my topic, like on the canvas? Okay. Just
No,
make sure I didn't.
No, I missed it at least. So when did you send it?
I sent it on yesterday, 3:49.
Okay, no, I apologize. I think I missed it. Let me propose we wait until next week and let you present it and talk about it, just so we have a few minutes now, because we've only got 8 minutes left. I'm trying to at least put up briefly so you can all see that this is something to take a look at, which is a way of systematizing some of the things I've been saying. Wenmeo, if you could possibly, I apologize for not asking in advance, if you could try to bring up the Blaylock, Blalock, or Blaylock and Stinchcomb. It's on the reading list, and I think it's on the. I'm quite sure it's on the Canvas website. If we could bring that up and just look at some of the pictures, and I'll talk about them now while you're looking for it. The idea is to just look at some of these little paths, these little pictures of paths of arrows and boxes, and let them, and see if you can put your topics into arrows and boxes in a way which they are doing, which mostly Blaylock is doing there. He took this by trying to systematize what lots of different kinds of people have been doing. And you can be in literature, you can be in film, you can be a novelist. So Faulkner may have written out, all the connections among his characters, the themes, the and so forth. And so you can use this whether you're in science or literature or whatever, but it's a way of also being explicitly, if you try to do empirical research and say measure the strength, that is, you can have, the classic simple causal statement is X leads to Y. What Blaylock then adds, and Wenmeo, are you finding it or not? No answer. Wenmeo, do you hear me?
Yeah, I'm finding it. So shall I share
Okay.
the screen right now?
Yeah, just go ahead. Yeah, share it on the screen and then just scroll down to the pictures. So instead of my having to summarize pictures.
Yeah. So can you-
Just scroll down. It's maybe as soon as there's a picture, just stop there. Great. Okay, here we go. This is good. So here is a single model for the inventory of causes. So this is X1, 2, 3, 4, XN. These can be different causes for, say, Chinese nationalism. And they may be income, they may be how often you watch the social media, they may be many different things. Inventory of causes. So let's scroll on. Okay, here's another one, which can be causal model for bureaucracy variables. These are from actual studies. The dotted lines represent relationships that apply only to complex organizations. So we can show multiple things, technical complexity, specialization, etc. Okay, let's scroll on, because you can come back and you can read about these a bit, but the main thing is just to look at the pictures and say, how could I use something like that for my topic? Okay, so here we have levels of types of paths coming together. And that's okay. You don't need to make it, just scroll on down a little more. The idea is just to mainly see the pictures, because this is on Canvas, you can all look at it, but I just wanted to show it briefly so you get the idea that you can play with these pictures, and most people start the way you're starting, and they don't get to this maybe until 5 years later. And in the cases of some of these, they've actually measured each of these variables and then estimated the strength of each of these different paths. So marital stability, C is the dependent variable here. Affect balance. So it's about divorce, family stability and divorce. Okay, let's scroll on. Okay, this is an inventory of effects that is not of causes, but of consequences. So what are the consequences of holding stronger Chinese nationalism? Or what happens if you retire at 35 instead of 55? What are the consequences? Scroll on. There are lots of consequences is the point of that. Okay, here we have a combination of both inventory of causes and inventory of effects. And then you can see here, you can write these as equations, but you don't need to, but let's go on. Okay, so here are chains and loops, a causal loop. So we have something is going around in a circle, W goes to X, X goes to Y, Y goes to Z. And then over time, so time 1, time 2, time 3, over time, each of these may strengthen the one another. So in a sense, this is not saying there's just one cause, but each of these are all working and they're feeding over time into the next. Onward, we're near the end. Yeah, don't bother to change that. It takes too long. Just get to the pictures, because there are only a few pictures here. And people can go back and take a look at this. I just want to bring it up here. Okay, so here again, you get another illustration of a main theory combined with an auxiliary theory for testing purposes. So the idea here is that above the dotted line, you have a theory. Below the dotted line, you have empirical measures. So when you've talked about reading about something, say the retirement age in the census, you may have a number down below, but you then may want to try to connect that to different theories above that line. So there are two kinds of work which are combined in this picture and explicitly shown as distinct. Don't mix up data with your theory or see them as so yes, you want to connect them, but in a thoughtfully thought through way. Onward. Okay, there may be no pictures here. Just scroll on a little bit more. Yeah, I guess the other thing is if you even really want more detail, I'd say skip that. I mean, most of this is Stinchcombe's section. Stinchcombe's mostly got ideas about creativity. The big idea of what Stinchcombe is here for you now is that Stinchcombe doesn't say read the literature and do what Max Weber said to do or what Marx said to do. What Stinchcombe says is you've got to come up with your own theory. Each of you are innovators. Each of you are scientific creators in doing your MA. And so to think about how you can use past work to build your MA in your own words and your thinking is something which needs more explicit attention. That's his big point. So read about it, you can see that, and you see the pictures to get ways to help you be more creative in systematizing and thinking more creatively about your own thinking, which is why they're together. Okay, why don't we end on that? We're 1 minute over time. We can stay on briefly for if there's some individual office hour kinds of things you want to talk about with me, and maybe I'll ask if Wen Mio can stay on technically for just a little bit now. But we're mainly, as you can see, we got a small enough class. It's great that we can really talk with each other and have personal engagement week by week. Read as much as you can for next week, and we will go ahead with the items which are there list. Yeah, okay, yeah. Let me just add. It's really as I say in the syllabus, we're not going to talk in detail about Marx because, but I'd say if you want to see the fun book, take a look at Arguing the World. It's a book in a video. It's really the video. Emil Durkheim's theories is part 1 and part 2 is Max Weber. Okay, these are two of the biggest classics in sociology. This is not a history of theory. We're not trying to just teach them, but we're distilling aspects of them for cultural analysis. So I've pulled out from this some bits of pages narrowly defined, which are at the bottom. I think here. Don't we have this? I thought I sent this. These are, yeah, here we go. Top of page 4 in the syllabus says, read snippets of Durkheim's many works in Parsons et al. Theories of Society. And then it's got 1, 2, 3 big selections. So the point here is not to say Durkheim said X, and that's his theory of culture. Durkheim had 3 drastically different ways of analyzing culture. And I just have 3, Max Weber. These guys were so big, so smart. They did so many different things. There are a lot, we could spend, a year just reading their works. But for sure, they are the foundation of lots of what comes in the rest of the course. And if you buy just one book, probably get this book, Parsons' Theories of Society, because it's got such good selections and then introductions. And it's co-edited by several different people. Edward Shills, especially with Talcott Parsons. And then Parsons tries to synthesize the best of Durkheim and Weber and come up and thus really redefine sociology over the 20th century. Okay, that's the theme for next week. Read as much as you can, and we'll talk about it. And then, of course, how does this relate to each of your papers? All right. Anybody have a last question or comment, especially administrative stuff? And/or we can talk further in office hours if there's some individual with a personal problems.
I
I
didn't. Oh, you can go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I just want to ask for the people who do not going to do the project, the paper, and deciding to take the exam, what's the format of the exam and when will it take place?
Probably a mixture of IDs, of identification concepts briefly, and then an essay. And we'll probably give you some topics to write on, and you can choose one topic for the essay. That's our normal format. It's not meant to be tricky. It's meant to help you. I mean, just to help you get the biggest ideas and to build on them. But to cover, I mean, well, let me put differently. I would recommend, I mean, if you're in this course, it's not just a seminar about writing. It's trying to join the best theories of culture that are out there, and you can't build on them if you don't read them. So if you only listen to the discussion, you're going to miss 90%. You've got to read on your own, put these together. And the best way to tell yourself that I know this stuff is to take the exam. So I'd recommend you all take the exam. And if you're doing a paper, but if you're just doing your MA, fine, do your MA. But I would recommend, reading as much as you can, but put differently, if you do both the exam and the paper, your grade will only go up. If you do just one or the other, you've got to do a better job on that one alone. Okay, so there we go. Anything else like that as an administrative question?
Yeah, about the readings. So are all the readings available somewhere online, or we should buy physical books? It's kind of maybe a missing on syllabus. Yeah.
Most of them are online, but we're not permitted to post online more than something like 100 pages. So for things that are, I think we have the recommended books. The most important one I just mentioned, but and I mean, each of you are at different stages. Some of you may retire at 35 with $10 million, and maybe you're buying lots of books, or maybe you're not buying any books because you're saving your money to retire. So I would say, depending on what your own plans are, buy more, fewer books. But these are probably the most important at the top. Most of them, full books, can be accessed through the University of Chicago Library as electronic books. So if you really don't want to buy, you can get them that way. And we, when Mio added that to the syllabus for the Parsons book, Theories of Society. So you can see the selections in that big book, but it's it's only one volume. I'm holding it up here, but it's over 1,000 pages. You can buy this for $18. And it's hardcover. I mean, so they're discounting it very heavily because they sell so many copies. So I'd say if you get one, probably get that. Then you've got a good reference source for lots of other purposes on culture and related themes. Others of you may want to buy all of these books listed at the beginning, but we don't have any forced requirement. Any other questions? Okay, well, I'm excited to hear these topics and all of your creativity in many different directions with the ways that were not so clear in the written statements, but it's going to be fun for us all. So read on, and let's continue on next Tuesday. Office hours, yeah. Anybody who has office hours you want to stay on, that's fine. Or Taylor, do you have a more general question for others that should stay? No, okay.
No, just good class. See you all next week.
Waving, okay.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.